Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. So, today a different kind of video. Basically, even more of a work in progress than usual. The thing is that I have a lot of thoughts in my head lately, and I'm trying to organize them somehow. Several times already, I wanted to sort of make this, do this as a lecture. And I might get around to that, but at this stage, I don't feel that my thought is well formed enough. So once again, this is disclaimer, right? This is very much a work in progress, and I have no idea. This may get very chaotic. Also, I'm purposefully not using my usual sound setup, so again, apologies for the audio quality. So nominally, I've titled this video Marxism on War. And let me immediately say something which I think is very important, is that this title might seem to be relevant to certain particular events which are going on right now. And let me make a comment on that. See, this is not a live lecture. This is a recording. So you do not necessarily know when this lecture was recorded. And I do not necessarily know when you are going to listen to this lecture, well, draft of a lecture, let's put it that way. And I'm saying this immediately to make a very important point, that it may very well be that there is a humanitarian crisis going on right as you are listening to this recording. And as a Marxist, I find it tragic, but I also find it very instructive, because this is how capitalism operates, especially the kind of the post-colonial neoliberal capitalism that we have in the 21st century. This description, this phrase about war going on, maybe humanitarian crisis, claims of human rights abuses, or maybe claims of war crimes. I mean, if you search the news, there's something like this going on all the time, and has been going on. A year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And unfortunately, since I expect most of you will listen to this in the future and not on the day that I'm recording this, a very high chance that if we are still within the logic of imperialist capitalism, or imperialist post-colonial neoliberal capitalism, while we are still within this logic of this kind of capitalist world order, this is still probably going to be true into the future. 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I don't say this lightly, and I don't say this gleefully, right? So this is a tragic circumstance. And again, when I say tragic, I'm saying this, I'm talking from a very particular standpoint, from the standpoint of Marxism. And as a Marxist, I say that, human rights abuses and wars and famines are tragic because people suffer needlessly. People suffer needlessly, and also because this kind of violence, internal and external, is endemic to the capitalist system. And the capitalist system is also, as a Marxist, I feel, is needless in a sense that the capitalist system is not inevitable. It's not the one and only way to do things, right? There are alternatives. Now, immediately, let me say that I'm a pessimistic, Gramscian, Weberian Marxist. Gramsci talks about war of position, and Max Weber talks about how politics is starkes, langsames Bohren von harten Brettern. Yes, so slow boring of hard boards. Yeah, young and optimistic and maybe slightly naive Marx expected the communist revolution, let's say, around the year 1848, but we older pessimistic Marxists after Gramsci, after Weber, and maybe very importantly, Marxists after Foucault, and also after Immanuel Wallerstein, we don't expect the revolution to happen, with a snap of a finger. In fact, I personally don't even think about this transformation in terms of a, singular event like a revolution. And in this sense, I think that my thinking about this is very Gramscian. Yeah, Gramsci talks about the war of position, slow and tedious war of position, whereby organic intellectuals seek to reform restructure the debates within the civil society slowly and gradually. Yeah? And whenever I talk about this, strong institutions of civil society, strong national institutions of civil society, but maybe more importantly, international institutions of civil society, which are almost completely non-existent today. Yeah, maybe to drop another very important name, so Jürgen Habermas talks about this Lebenswelt, yeah, the life world, the potential expansion, something that we are hoping for, that the life world of communicative rationality and civil society, free and equal discussion in civil society. Or maybe I should say we, the pessimistic post-Foucauldian, post-Wallersteinian Marxists, we see this post-Habermasian Marxists, we see this again as a slow transition, as a slow war of position, whereby again the sphere of communicative rationality and the free and equal discussion in the civil society seeks to expand itself and protect itself from the encroachments of market rationality, of capitalism, and also the state bureaucracy, which is also an integral part of the way that neoliberal world order works today. This collusion, this confluence of power between market capitalism and state bureaucracy. If you want market capitalism and state capitalism. Incidentally, if you want to know more about this, I have my 16-lecture course on the Introduction to Political Philosophy, which hopefully should be available on this channel. The link to the playlist is hopefully somewhere in the description. Course in which I hope to take the students ideally from Plato to Foucault and Habermas, but if not from Plato, at least from Thomas Hobbes to Foucault and Habermas. Yeah, so it's a very nice phrase, from Plato to Foucault and Habermas, but if not from Plato, then at least from Thomas Hobbes to Foucault and Habermas. This, pretty much sums up my approach to social and political issues. So it's like if you ever want life advice from me, or if you want me to comment on some particular, let's say, newsworthy topic, that's the beginning of my response. Listen to my 16 lectures from Plato to Habermas, and then we'll talk. It's a bit of a joke on the one hand, but on the other hand, I mean this quite seriously. And again, I think in the words of Miles Bernier, how in Plato, the Platonic approach to philosophy, with which actually I think I identify more and more as years go by, is that every question leads to every other question. Every question leads to every other question. I was young, and when I only began doing philosophy, it was always very interesting to take single issues, like single thought experiments, like the dreaded, infamous, and I feel extremely counterproductive trolley problem. These single issues that you take in isolation. But the older I became, kind of working through the history of Western philosophy backwards, starting with Foucault, then Marx clearly is hugely important for me. So from Foucault through Marx, through maybe Hegel, ultimately, eventually, these days I find myself reading Plato with more and more understanding and with more and more interest. Reading Plato, although I have to say in my very own way. Reading Plato as a proto-Marxist, reading Plato as a maybe materialist, reading Plato as a sophist or somebody sympathetic to the sophists. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, let me go back to war. Again, there is an immediate occasion for me to record this lecture. There are particular events which stimulate me, sort of stimulate my thinking in this particular tragic, very tragic, very brutal direction. But within my way of looking at things, which is, one way to describe it would be that I'm a Marxist who is sympathetic to the realist tradition, especially the realist tradition in the international relations, meaning thinkers such as Thucydides, Machiavelli, or Hobbes. So basically, one way to simplistically label my position is as a Marxist who is sympathetic to Hobbes and Machiavelli, or Marxist who is sympathetic to Thucydides. My home for the past several years was the International Relations Department, and most of my colleagues, at least most people I talk to, are usually the opposite. They are realists who are sympathetic to Marxism. and I'm a Marxist who is sympathetic to realism, right? And I've mentioned this in some of the previous videos. I do feel that there's a broad overlap between the realist and the Marxist traditions. The structuralist overlap, this trying to see social reality as products of, as a product of forces and mechanisms, and kind of the skeptical stance towards accepted traditional morality. Both the Marxists and the realists would say that norms of justice are usually simply defined by power groups, by groups in power to suit their own interest. It's an oversimplification a little bit, but that's I feel that's a good starting position. And if we look, for example, at Plato's Republic, if we look at the figure of Thrasymachus, Thrasymachus can equally be claimed as a forerunner of the realist and of the Marxist tradition, right? So Thrasymachus in Plato's Republic says, justice is simply the interest of the stronger. The ruling party in any society define the norms of justice to suit their interest, right? And again, this position in Thrasymachus is equally a position which anticipates later realist tradition and later Marxist tradition. And actually, more specifically on this topic of war, both the realists and the Marxists would say that society is ultimately based on force and fraud, on coercion, violence, and deception. That ultimately law is based on lawlessness. A constitutional regime is established by an act of violence, kind of primordial violence. This is obviously very true for Hobbes, but this is also true for Machiavelli, and I think for Thucydides as well. And honestly, I would count Rousseau as a part of this tradition. Rousseau is kind of an interesting figure, I feel, on the intersection between realist and Marxist traditions also. Let me parenthetically note that kind of right now, I'm feeling actually very proud of myself because, again, there's a news story going on right now, but my explicit purpose to myself, my explicit task to myself was to not talk about that directly, but, to take a step back and do the philosophical thing and to try to, think through the context in general terms. I feel so far I'm succeeding in that respect with flying colors, because I'm sure I've lost everybody who has come here to hear some kind of a personal take, some kind of a political commentary on the current events. Like the people who came here hoping, expecting me to take sides and to shout, they're all gone, because instead of taking sides and shouting, I'm talking about Thrasymachus and Plato's Republic, right? That's the approach. Honestly, I haven't even started, because before I can begin talking about, the issue of war, there's at least a couple of other methodological points I want to get out of the way. This is, a bit of a note to self, but also a bit of, I don't know, if you want oral history. This is in general how I prepare my lectures. Like the first take is like this, talking about everything at the same time, being completely all over the place. And to be honest, I don't like writing very much. I very much prefer talking, especially to a live audience, which is not the case right now. But I have enough of a capacity for imagination to imagine my colleagues and students who potentially would listen to this. So that's good enough. But then obviously what I would need to do is I'm probably going to end up posting this just in terms of self-discipline, because in private conversation very often we use language which is sloppy and careless and overly emotional, but like I have to make a promise to myself that I will upload all this stuff to YouTube at least, just as a way to hold myself accountable and to just raise the standard of this internal dialogue which goes on in my head and which right now I'm externalizing a little bit. I kind of at the same time hope that people do find this useful, because I think this is in general what philosophy is about. To do philosophy is to resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. To do philosophy is to know how to step back from the fray of political argument And again, resist the temptation to jump to conclusion. The ancient Greek term for this would be epoche, suspension of judgment, bracketing out, right? So taking a step back, bracketing out, and just hanging out in the middle, appreciating the complexity of a situation, any situation. So I've been teaching philosophy for more than 10 years now. I've been doing philosophy for about 20 years. Very often, as we are talking in the classroom, as we are discussing, I don't know, Plato or Hobbes or Marx, something very dramatic is happening outside, at least dramatic from the standpoint of the students whom I see in front of myself. So there might be a particular issue that causes great distress to my students, to my colleagues, sometimes to my relatives, yeah? And maybe this is just nature of political life. This is just the nature of human condition, right? That people feel the urgency. People feel the urgency to take a stance, and people feel the urgency to, to raise a flag, for or against a particular issue. People feel the urgency to speak out on a particular issue in very dramatic terms, very dramatic and very decisive terms. And philosophy is not like that. And this is incidentally why philosophy has, since time immemorial, has been seen as politically and religiously treacherous, treasonous. Again, I remind you, colleagues, that Socrates was condemned, was found guilty on the charges of treason against the state of Athens. And I feel that there's something to this, right? Notice, I talk about philosophy and I talk about politics. This is very true in the Western tradition. The Western tradition, well, it doesn't begin solely with Socrates, but Socrates is one of the, let's say, the privileged starting point of the Western tradition. Keeping the pre-Socratics in mind, but Socrates, very importantly, is a crucial starting position for the Western political, not just political, but philosophical tradition in general, and Socrates' stance is deeply political. Do philosophy is to engage in politics. If nothing else, to engage in politics of the self. And Socrates has this very interesting stance. Presumably, probably, as far as we can tell, as far as I can tell, Socrates begins with the individual. He doesn't talk, he doesn't shout in the agora for or against. Yeah, he talks to individual, particular people. He holds private conversations. Important respect, that's kind of, I guess, something like what I'm doing right now, because first of all, I do have very particular people in mind when I record this. But secondly, I mean, look at this. Again, there's something going on in the news right now I want to respond to, and I'm spending, Jupiter knows how many minutes, 10, 20 minutes, just, in these broad methodological introductions. I've lost everybody who's not my friend already. I've lost everybody. Like, nobody's listening to this right now who's not already on board, at least to a significant degree, with my general sort of outlook on life. So just to illustrate, but also to kind of elaborate on this point, is that if you have a divisive issue, and by the way, we do have these divisive issues all the time. If you just think back 2, 3, 4, 5 years into the past, think about these crusades that people wage, especially on social media, online. Issues of public policy, elections, wars, social reform, healthcare, what have you. I mean, reform of the university system. Something is on the news all the time. Maybe globally, maybe nationally, maybe very locally, maybe within the department in which I teach or something like that. And so to go back to the point that I'm trying to make right now is that philosophy is not about taking sides. It's about taking a step back. It's about resisting the temptation to jump to conclusions. I'd say maybe this is the defining feature of philosophy. And it's also a feature which is seen as treacherous and treasonous by both sides, both sides of the issue when the issue arises politically. And again, which very often happens, or is like most of the time the case. Like having a polarizing issue around which people are engaging in screaming matches, right? This is very much a constant, normal state of affairs, lately, in the past several years. In the past several years, at the very least. I don't necessarily want to make broad generalizations, but then at the same time, when I read Plato's dialogues, when I say in recent years, maybe these recent years go back at least to the ancient Greeks. But sorry, let me continue with my point. Yeah, and so again, philosophy takes a step back, and this is seen as treacherous or treasonous. And there's a wonderful quote in Thucydides about the civil war, the stasis in Corcyra, where it's a fairly long passage, and it's very dramatic, very vivid. It's also very tragic and very brutal, and in many ways hits a bit too close to home at times. I suppose just one sentence I want to focus on is this idea that in times of crisis, in times of polarization, in times of civil war, somebody who's trying to be calm and level-headed is seen by the traitor, is seen as a traitor by both sides, is seen to be a traitor by both sides. Yeah. The basic logic being is that if you are not actively a supporter of our cause, then you are part of the problem, then you are the enemy. Like if you are not explicitly my ally, then you are my enemy. Yeah. Now, to be fair, and by the way, I still haven't gotten out all of the methodological things I want to say before I begin talking about Marxism and war. Probably, if you had the patience to listen this far, you are not the kind of person, my dear listener, to fall into these traps. And I feel it does take a certain amount of discipline and training to train your mind to, again, resist the temptation to jump to conclusions and to learn to hang out in this space in the middle and to appreciate the complexity of the situation, the complexity of any situation. And let me also immediately say that I think that it's, broadly speaking, unnatural for a human mind to do that. So within this kind of evolutionary or evolutionary psychological paradigm, in which I operate, we have a certain story about how human mind evolves, and human mind basically evolves as a machine for jumping to conclusions. Human thinking evolves within this biological genetic evolution, but also within the logic of the cultural, if you want to use this phrase, mimetic evolution. The point of both of these evolutionary processes, these parallel evolutionary processes of biological and cultural evolution, the driving logic, the driving force, the driving mechanic behind these processes of evolution is, in simplest terms, it's survival and reproduction. Survival and reproduction of the genes or of the memes. Broadly speaking, if you want, there's a certain kind of competition, quasi-Darwinian or maybe Darwinian natural selection, so I should say natural selection and cultural selection, where certain particular forms compete against each other, and more efficient genetic, or if you want to use this phrase again, mimetic forms drive other genetic or mimetic forms to extinction. Yeah. So all of this is to say that calm thinking and level-headedness is not natural, and in fact, in many ways, doing philosophy and thinking clearly, in some sense, and this is incidentally why I feel philosophy has been described as treacherous or treasonous, religiously impious or impious, because to do philosophy in an important sense is to rebel against natural selection. Philosophy as an art of self-defense, philosophy as a rebellion or revolt or resistance against the status quo, care of the self, at least since the time of Socrates, but actually since the time of the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus. Philosophy as critical of its culture, culturally critical, subversive. And I'm slowly trying to get to my main point here. And I want to have this discussion from a Marxist perspective, but in general, I feel that my approach is informed by three names symbolically, and those would be, let's say, Buddha, Marx, and Foucault. I say Foucault, although I kind of mean Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Foucault, but let's just stick with Foucault for now. Foucault, who reads Nietzsche through a Heideggerian lens. So let me go back a step. All three thinkers Buddha and Marx and Foucault all three have this very important critical aspect in their philosophy. It's understanding that human beings kind of by nature do not see reality clearly, and it takes work and training and discipline to see reality in a more, in clearer terms, and one needs to work to restructure one's life, and as a society we need to work to restructure our society. And I feel that kind of in a certain basic elementary form, all three, Buddha and Marx and Foucault, could agree with this, critical and reformist assessment, or critical and reformist agenda, I guess. I'm obviously simplifying grossly, but as a starting position, this works. Now, since I absolutely pathologically cannot comment on any issue without giving full-fledged methodological introduction, let me say a couple more words. By way of methodology, of a methodological forward. I will talk from a Marxist standpoint, but why Marxist? Why Marxist? Is it because I believe that Marxism somehow is a true description of reality? And the short answer is no, and let me immediately take a step back from that. Students these days, or in general, kind of in the culture these days, you hear very often, these ideas of, let's say, falsification, right? Go back to Karl Popper. And very often students will say, well, but is Marxism a falsifiable theory or something like that? And let me say that I don't think that falsification works. I don't think that falsification, Popperian falsification works anywhere. It doesn't even work in physics. Because if you look closely at, for example, debates in contemporary physics, like debates around dark matter, there's the lambda CDM concordance cosmology, CDM standing for cold dark matter. And if you look at the debates between that perspective, the CDM perspective, and let's say the Mond perspective, which is the modified Newtonian dynamics, it's very clear that it's not a question of verification or falsification. Yes, empiricism and paying attention to the data has to be an important part of our toolkit, but theories are never straightforwardly verified or falsified. Theories are more or less useful. Theories are more or less illuminating. And this is true even in physics. You see, social theory or political theory is so much more complex than physics. I mean, fundamental physical problems are intractable in an important methodological way, right? So, nobody should expect the solution, the final solution to the black hole information paradox, or the final solution to the, foundations of quantum mechanics, deciding between different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Nobody should expect those debates to really ever be settled. Because it's not a question of right or wrong. It's not a question of describing reality exactly. It's always a question of having more or less useful approximations, more or less pragmatically illuminating interpretations. Physics is simple. Physics is simple, right? Falsification doesn't work in physics, and once you take subjects which are more complex, like, let's say, biology, falsification, it's untenable in physics. It's much less tenable, although I'm not sure what it means to be less tenable than untenable, right? But it's much more problematic in biology or medicine, because the kinds of rigorous and robust and very precisely controlled experiments that you can do in physics, you cannot do in biology. Questions that you can ask, very precisely quantifiable questions about physical theories that you can ask, that you simply cannot ask with respect to, let's say, medicine or biology, let's say with respect to question of vaccines. The kind of precision, the kind of generalizations that we have, for example, when we measure black hole collisions or neutron star collisions through, gravitational waves, yeah? This kind of precision is simply not available when we try to, make statements about, efficacy of vaccines, for example. Kind of what I'm driving at is that biology and medicine is so much more complex than physics. I mean, ultimately everything within this kind of naturalistic worldview, ultimately everything is reducible to physics, right? Reducible ultimately, methodologically, in theory, but not in practice. Because in theory, in principle, you could try to calculate the effect of a vaccine by solving, I don't know, Feynman diagrams, calculating Lagrangians. That's obviously fantasy, right? It's methodologically, in theory, you can try to do that, but in reality, even a three-body problem, like simple Newtonian equations, don't have exact analytical solutions. In the general case, even for just three bodies orbiting each other. So biology is so much more complex than physics, and then sociology or psychology are so much more complex than biology. And some of you might ask, like, why am I talking about this? I'm planning to talk about Marxism and war. Why do I go on about physics and chemistry and biology? Well, because I feel that people have to understand this. We have to appreciate the complexity of human condition. We have to appreciate that individuals with their individual psychologies, like a psychological system within the head of a particular individual, is so much more complex than the kinds of things that we study, for example, in cellular biology or in particle physics. And I think presumably social and political theory have to be even more complex than individual psychology, because we're talking about different psychologies, different individuals interacting. So the level of complexity is orders and orders of magnitude higher. Therefore, the robustness and the precision of the theories has to be orders of magnitudes lower. But also, in addition to all of this, the language with which we describe reality, and I should by right do maybe a series of lectures just on that, the problems of language and description. So actually, very famously, just to give one example, Hegel talks in the Phenomenology of Spirit, he talks about this verkehrte Welt, inverted world argument, Verkehrung. I think the example that Hegel gives is that, you imagine trial by jury, and the jurors are looking at a particular case, and they can perform this, what we would call today a Gestalt switch, if you know about Wittgensteinian duck rabbit. You look at the same case, at the same facts of the case, and then you kind of flip the judgment in your own head. You say, is this, let's say, a vicious murder to be punished, or is this, let's say, a righteous revenge to be applauded? And the facts are the same, but the description differs. And actually, a while back, when I was only beginning to teach as a teaching assistant, I helped teach this course in sociology, and especially in kind of social methods of study, quantitative and qualitative methods, and this kind of idea of social construction of reality, among other things, how data about societies is socially constructed. There is no such thing as an objective measure. Like if you take death rates or birth rates, what do you count as death and what do you count as birth? Maybe just to refer to Durkheim for a second here. I mean, you see a dead body in front of you, and then a coroner has to make a decision. Was this suicide? Was this murder? Was this an accident? Was this just a person died from old age? As a normal course of events. Kind of this idea which goes back, through Heidegger, through Hegel, through Kant, goes back probably to the ancients, probably to Plato, this idea that our access to reality is always necessarily mediated by a language that we use to describe reality. And in an important sense, it's like, again, I want to talk about war, and yet I talk about all of these methodological precautions, yeah? And I feel that that's the right way to do things. Because if you don't understand all of these problems, methodological problems, let's say if you don't understand what social construction of reality means, then it's useless to talk about war, because you don't understand what war means. Like before you do astronomy, you have to make sure that your telescope is well-tuned, fine-tuned. And actually right now, I have devoted a huge chunk of this talk to the discussions of methodology, and I feel that there's deep therapeutic value in that. So maybe to use this analogy, if you come to a yoga class, before you actually do, series of asanas, right? You try to prepare your body and mind through particular kinds of exercise that are supposed to tune your mind and body in a particular way. This is kind of what I'm doing. I mean, certainly I feel much calmer right now than I was when I was thinking about doing this talk earlier this morning. And hopefully maybe this also has a kind of a therapeutic effect on you. So, Marxism on war. almost there. So, Marxism, yes, I want to examine the Marxist perspective, but as I'm examining the Marxist perspective, always keeping in mind my 3 rules of method, which are, maybe skepticism, fallibilism, and empiricism. Skepticism, we try to resist temptation to jump to conclusions. Already said about this, probably the most important of the rules. Second, fallibilism. Yes, I am a Marxist because I think that Marxism is highly illuminating, but I am not a dogmatic Marxist about my beliefs. I believe that they may be false, so I'm open to revision. So everything I say has to be taken as a kind of as a hypothesis, as a working hypothesis. I'm not trying to claim that Marxist perspective is true. In fact, in social sciences, I don't think that any perspective can claim that. In fact, what we have is a multitude of perspectives, which are all probably illuminating to a lesser or a greater degree. And I take certain comfort emotionally in calling myself a Marxist. I'm not sure. This is always a big question for me. Should I stop? Maybe people misunderstand. But, in times like these, it's just helpful. I don't know. It's psychologically helpful for me to say, yes, like I come from this particular perspective. I come from this particular tradition. So Buddha, Marx, Foucault. So I'm a Buddhist, Foucauldian Marxist, or Marxist, Foucauldian Buddhist, or at least I'm aspiring to be that. Not because I know or I can prove or I have faith that Marxism or Buddhism or Foucault is true, but because so far in my experience I have found them to be productive and illuminating. And especially given the circumstances, especially because I have a particular event, occasion, something going on in the real world right now, which I want to respond to, looking at the events unfolding outside my window, I am reminded of why I call, or always have this temptation to call myself a Marxist throughout all these years, because I feel that among all the perspectives that I entertain, among all the philosophers that I teach, Marx and Marxist perspective has this privileged status, privileged in the sense that time after time after time, I find what Marx or Marxists have to say, I find it most illuminating and most useful without obviously claiming it to be the whole truth or complete truth. I'd say I'm a Marxist because I find it time and time again, I find that Marxism is a highly useful, highly illuminating starting point. So Marxism is useful as a starting point, but also so Marxism, again, as a starting point, but also the kind of analysis that Marx or Marxism offers in, let's say, in any given situation, appears to me, again, time and time again, appears to me to be highly valuable and highly illuminating. So, to put this simply, Marxism, I feel, is a very useful starting point, but also explains a lot. Marxism is highly illuminating, highly useful. It doesn't explain the situation in its entirety, but it goes a very long way to explaining the basic features of any given situation. Yeah. And also, very often, the kind of analysis that Marxism offers is very different from what people immediately and automatically assume. It's also very different from the kind of stories that get published in newspapers, or the kinds of narratives that get traction on social media. Yeah, I feel that Marxism offers a very robust account, and also like a very counterintuitive account, and also like an account, a way of looking at things, a perspective, a narrative, which is sorely missing from our public debate. And incidentally, let me also note that Marxists have a way of explaining, they have an explanation, they have an account as to why this happens, as to why the Marxist perspective gets played down. Marxism has a certain way of analyzing the current situation, of analyzing the exploitative and the kind of the power-laden character of the status quo. So Marxism, by uncovering the structure of the status quo, also unmasks the oppression and the violence which exists behind it. So by offering this kind of an analysis, Marxism at the same time subverts the status quo. And therefore, the people who are the gatekeepers, the people who are in power, consciously or unconsciously would be kind of unmotivated to take this kind of a position. This is basically what Marx calls ideology. So almost there, almost there. So just to restate, the three rules of method, my three rules of method, three guiding posts: skepticism, fallibilism, empiricism. Skepticism, resist the temptation to jump to conclusions. Fallibilism, understand that, like, we operate with working hypotheses and not with truth, and any kind of hypotheses could turn out to be wrong and does have its limitations. And the third one, empiricism, is that, of course, we have to pay attention to the data, but the problem is that's very difficult to do at times, but we do have to try. I don't really want to elaborate at length on this third point of empiricism, but as I've already mentioned, empiricism, for me, immediately I'm thinking of phenomenology, this attempt to analyze the experience, the way it presents itself to us, right? Be a thoroughgoing empiricist is actually a very difficult thing to do, because there are all sorts of automatic assumptions that our culture makes and also that our biology or psychology makes. It's very difficult to bracket those assumptions out. To be a bit closer to home, again, when we talk about social and political issues, it's easy to talk about empiricism. Okay, let's be empirical, but the problem is, how do you gather empirical data in in social and in and around social and political issues? Even the simplest, the most straightforward statistics is gathered by people, and there's always room for bias, misinformation, but also, maybe sometimes, potentially sometimes very intentional, cover-ups, deception. So keeping all this in mind, let me try to talk about war. And I guess the first thing I want to say is that this distinction between domestic and international politics is kind of alien to Marxism, in the sense that Marxists question this. If the state deploys troops against its own population, it's also, broadly speaking, a kind of a war. I mean, yes, in an oversimplified fashion, you can just take an isolated country for, within the Marxist analysis, and just say, okay, you have a country, and within the country you have two classes, bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the ruling class and the oppressed class, which are immediately a bit of a simplification, because Marx is always attentive to details and to distinctions, and, not like Marx believed that in any society there are two and only two classes. That is an analytic simplification. Again, to go back to this kind of simplified picture, kind of in this isolated state which exists in a vacuum, yes, you have two classes, and, same way that, let's say, feudal order was based on explicit coercion and violence, the serfs owe service and taxes to the lords, and if serfs do not fulfill their functions, then the army will be deployed against them. So in a similar fashion, in capitalism, the workers are forced to work by necessity, because otherwise they'll starve or their life will be unpalatable, and if the workers strike, then then the government will deploy police forces or military forces against them to crush the strikes. That's a very, very, very oversimplified and kind of generalized picture, and it has to be like a lot of nuance needs to be introduced. It would take many hours, it would take many lectures to explain all the nuance. For example, when we talk about violence, sometimes violence is just open violence. When you have, police shooting protesters with lethal weapons, which does happen today and did happen in history. Sometimes violence is not overt in this sense, but sometimes violence can be more covert when there's a threat of violence. And this threat itself can be more or less open, more or less explicit. Then, on a deeper level, and it's very important for Marxists, that kind of, again, Clausewitz has this phrase that war is a continuation of policy by other means, and I feel that for the Marxists and for somebody like Foucault, no, it's actually policy, politics is a continuation of war by other means. Is to say that, again, so violence can be open, actual violence, or it can be threat of violence, or it can be like covert threat of violence, or it could be ideological violence. I'm thinking maybe of Louis Althusser with his terms, ISA and RSA, ideological state apparatus and repressive state apparatus. Sometimes the ruling class stays in power, sometimes the ruling class exercises its will through active repression, and sometimes the ruling class exercises its will through symbolic violence. So, which is, again, what Althusser calls ideological state apparatus. I think it's very important to see this mechanistic, anti-teleological, if you want, post-humanist perspective, which is very often associated with, let's say, the post-structuralist movement, people like Michel Foucault and Jacques Lacan. I feel that this post-humanist structuralist mode of thinking is very much implicit or even explicit in the works of Marx himself. The idea that, again, we are not born humans, we become humans. Again, like human individuality, human individual thought is linguistic, language is social, and societies are historical. So individuality is individuality is linguistic and therefore social and therefore historical. We are not born individuals, we are made individuals by society. Foucault talks a lot about this. Foucault has this phrase, sort of mode of subjectification. Society produces individuals as if like in a factory. Society produces individuals with a certain sets of ideas and values. Society has a certain way of producing, like particular internal psychological mechanisms with, particular structures, not structures, but like pathways of channeling desire. This is why, I talk about Buddha, Marx, and Foucault, but kind of implicit in there somewhere, maybe behind the name of Foucault, I'm also thinking about Lacan, I'm thinking about Freud, and Buddha has a lot to say about this as well. Because these like macro mechanisms, macro sociological mechanisms of control and oppression also have like a micro physical, I should say micro psychological underpinnings. So from like a sociological perspective, you could say, well, the state controls the media, or let's say the corporations control the media, the state and the corporations together control the media, control the narrative, and implant certain ideas in people's heads. You could say that kind of sociologically, but behind that statement, there's a psychological reality. Behind this broad sociological claim, there has to be methodologically a narrow psychological claim. Let's say a worker comes back from work and they are tired, and they switch on the television, they switch on the news because they feel tired, they feel anxious, they feel maybe depressed, and switching on the news is a coping mechanism. They watch the news like on mainstream channels because it's because the people there, let's say the newscasters speak well, they look nice, right? So it's pleasant in a certain, sometimes maybe sort of a masochistic pleasure of watching the news, because often they talk about kind of these dramatic and distressing topics, but there is a certain kind of like masochistic, addictive kind of pleasure. People sort of have to compulsively check the news. I mean, Marxist analysis is systemic analysis, and a system, right, is a kind of an arrangement where parts work together, right? So it's like, think about this phrase that I use to referring to Plato, that every question leads to every other question, right? So when you start from a particular worker who comes back from work and switches on the television, you could begin asking all sorts of questions like, what is the language in which they watch the television? most of the time, I would imagine that this would be their native language. So is an alternative perspective available to them? Well, to have an alternative perspective available, very often what you need to do is you need to be fluent in another language. So parallel to this, maybe you also need to be kind of technically savvy. You need to have like the access to the internet and be proficient with using the internet and have the skills to effectively find and get exposed to different points of view. Again, in a very straightforward fashion, very often there's like a language barrier. So many people in the world today are not fluent in English. If you are not fluent in English, you immediately cut yourself off from the lingua franca of the intellectual world today. There are far more books or articles printed in English than in any other language. And, this is, on the one hand, just one example, but on the other hand, Marx talks about this in the Communist Manifesto. He talks about how capitalism creates a world culture, among other things, how capitalism creates a world literature. Well, in our globalized or maybe post-globalized world, do we really see this world culture emerging? And Marx might point to this deep asymmetry about how capital and capitalists have no country. Capitalists easily move between countries, and as a capitalist, as a bourgeois, you come to a different country, you can, if nothing else, you can hire a translator. And for the workers, this is sometimes very difficult to do, especially if you have conflicts between nations, workers have a hard time communicating across state lines because they just don't speak a common language. And of course, I'm not talking about war yet, but immediately, sort of kind of the basic Marxist standpoint is that in any kind of war, the suspicion has to be that this is a war waged by the ruling class to divide and conquer the working class. Because Marx, again, cosmopolitan, internationalist, the way that humanity moves forward for Marx is by building, Marxist terms, building like a communist workers' international, an international cosmopolitan workers' nation. Yeah, the trade union of trade unions, workers unionizing across industries and workers unionizing across the borders, across state lines. Habermasian terms, I would say this means, among other things, very importantly, creating robust institutions, international institutions of civil society. But also very importantly, to take a step back, again, you can see we have here a structuralist and like functionalist analysis, right? A worker watching the news is produced by the social system, but the news are also produced by the social system. And the ruling class and their mentality, their ideology is also produced by the social system. It is a very important contention of Marx that the bourgeoisie are not evil. Like Marx tries to take a step back from legalistic or moral terms because the norms of legality and the norms of morality are endogenous. They are created within the system. So at the end of the day, to speak of human agency for Marx is very problematic. In fact, it's very often counterproductive because it's not that individuals do certain things. It is that the social system creates certain kinds of individuals with particular, goals, values, desires, narratives, such that they do those things. So actually, in a very straightforward fashion, and I keep talking about this all the time, for me, the most important intellectual transition in the history of humanity is the transition from the teleological, kind of soul-based, to the mechanistic worldview. From the teleological to the mechanistic worldview. And within the mechanistic worldview, we don't believe in souls, we don't believe in free wills. We have this kind of structural systemic analysis. Human beings are ultimately not responsible for anything in a kind of an ontological way. There's no such thing as free will. And the notions of like desert or blame play no part. And in an important sense, again, I feel that Marxist notions of morality have to be very different from the kind of the bourgeois notions of morality. And to kind of maybe move closer to the topic at hand, right? So somebody like Kant or somebody like Locke would say, look, if there's an act of violence, that is often or sometimes that is an evil deed, that is evil, and this evil needs to be punished. So somebody like Locke or Kant might say. And let me be very explicit. I think that this idea of evil, kind of, I don't believe in evil. I think it's, believing in evil is like believing in witches. It's a bad idea, it's a wrong idea, it's a counterproductive idea at the end of the day. And in many ways, I feel that since the dawn of philosophy, people like Socrates or people like the Buddha, right, they just don't operate with the idea of evil. Likewise, when I read Machiavelli or Hobbes, I don't think that either of them believe that evil with a capital E exists in the world. Again, I like to refer to this phrase from Immanuel Kant. So for Machiavelli, for Thucydides, but also for Marx, very importantly, this world is the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter. Der Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie. So it's not that human beings are evil. It's that the world is bad, like in a Nietzschean sense. Not good and evil, but good and bad. In a sense that this world is less than perfect, is less than harmonious, is less than perfectly harmonious. And so people find themselves in these kind of less than perfect circumstances, and it's not that the people are bad, it's that the world is bad and, is less than perfectly hospitable. And so this world, which is less than perfectly hospitable, it drives individuals into conflicts with one another. And you may be reminded of Thomas Hobbes when I say these words, and I do feel that Hobbes and Marx are in basic agreement on this issue, that sort of, by nature, human societies are less than perfect, less than just. Human societies are conflictual. Kind of, you have war of all against all in Hobbes as a state of nature, and you have this history, which is history of oppression and class struggle for Marx. And I feel that there's a certain homology between what Hobbes is saying and between what Marx is saying. And also, to continue this analogy, actually both Hobbes and Marx, within this project of enlightenment, both of them are actually quite optimistic about the future, that they believe that human beings can understand the laws of society and thus reshape society to suit human needs, to make human life better. Now, when I say to make life better, I don't want to turn this into a kind of lecture on moral philosophy, but I do feel that there's a certain, like broadly speaking, quasi-utilitarian way of looking at things, which is applicable both to Hobbes and to Marx. And, I would subscribe, and to Buddha, as a matter of fact, and I would subscribe to as well. Kind of this topic that I would put under the rubric kind of naturalism about values. What does it mean to be naturalistic about values? I have some videos on the channel about that. I'm not sure I want to go down that path immediately. Right now. But to make some kind of an intermediate conclusion, for Marx or for Marxists, whenever we talk about war or violence or coercion or oppression, I feel it's very important to not kind of blame people and not to say, well, there are evil people and these evil people go to wars or these evil people commit violence. But we have to ask, what are the structural causes? Why does this happen? And this applies across class lines. So the bourgeoisie are not evil, and the proletariat are not evil. On Marxist analysis, again, the capitalist system as a whole is based on coercion and violence. But kind of the most important coercion and violence is done by the ruling class in their act of oppression. But they are not to blame for it in some kind of metaphysical or moral sense, because, again, for Marx, this is a logic of, like, quasi-Darwinian natural selection, that the bourgeoisie are also at the mercy of the system. Again, it's like the corporations, let's say, the businesses, have to oppress and exploit the workers, otherwise they go out of business and they become bankrupt. And this, again, I hope you can see this kind of Darwinian logic here. But then, the ruling class always has a certain way to dress up its violence under the guise of legality and decency. Kind of white-collar crime is not you take a brick and you smash it against the window and you come in and you take something, right? So white-collar crime, and capitalism is a white-collar crime in some sense for Marxism in general, right? White-collar crime has this kind of invisible character to it. Like it's all outwardly very decent. And so once you get to kind of to the visible violence that Marxists would talk about, kind of the visible violence in our society, the visible, palpable violence is perpetrated not by the capitalists. Their violence is invisible. It's the most important one, but it's invisible. The visible violence is perpetrated by the person in the street. The workers don't have the luxury of being able to commit these decent white-collar crimes. It is the workers who take bricks and smash windows with them. And so I think you can see the logic here, right? So it's not like workers, kind of this, aristocratic, racist and classist prejudice against the common people, that common people are just evil by nature. No, that's incidentally, that's not Hobbes and that's not Machiavelli. And certainly not Marx. But even Hobbes and Machiavelli would say that sort of in a well-functioning, in a well-ordered social system, there's organization, there are mechanisms, there are incentives, there are institutions that make for, a relatively harmonious society. So if people commit crimes, they commit crimes because they're driven to commit crimes, not because they're evil by nature. And I hope you can see how here kind of Marxist understanding of morality clashes very much against the kind of the standard understanding of morality. Again, I'm very happy to attach labels of Locke and Kant to this. Like, I genuinely think, take this as a hypothesis, take this as a grain of salt, but my working hypothesis is that Locke and Kant are not only wrong, but they are actually actively, counterproductive, unhelpful, and kind of deleterious. Kind of Lockean ideas and Kantian ideas are actively harmful because they prevent us from seeing the situation clearly, and they also prevent us from correcting, ameliorating, curing the situation. Again, you think in terms of an act of violence, and my Marxist question is, why was the person driven to this transgression, to theft or murder or maybe rape? And kind of the working hypothesis behind my Marxist structuralist analysis is that people are not born thieves or rapists or murderers, but they are driven to stealing, murdering, and raping by the exploitative social system in which they find themselves. And to just, blame them and send them to prison, that's not a helpful thing to do. In fact, it's the other way around. Again, you think in terms of the kind of prison industrial complex, it's good, it's helpful. Very often the governments want their citizens to end up in prison because, they then become source of cheap labor. And very often, if prisoners work in prison, you don't have to follow labor laws. So very often it's in the interest, or it very well might be in the interest of the government to put people in jail, to criminalize certain, victimless crimes, certain kinds of behavior. Well, I mean, you can probably understand where I'm going with this. You can think of your own examples. And then the kind of the immediate Kantian and Lockean response would be to say that my position is immoral, that what I'm doing right now is sinful and evil because I'm trying to excuse, right, and condone the actions of rapists, robbers, and murderers. And that's completely not my position. Like, I do not want to be raped or robbed or murdered. I do not want to live in a society in which this, violence is endemic. But kind of within the Marxist perspective, within the structuralist mechanistic perspective, crime is like a disease. It has particular objective causes. Like, if you think of this pandemic of COVID, like, you don't solve the COVID pandemic by claiming that the COVID virus is somehow evil and wants people to suffer. No, you look for objective causes and you look for ways, effective and efficient ways to ameliorate the situation. I mean, I also want to point out that, I feel that Lockean and Kantian moral systems are, untenable, and they collapse in on themselves as soon as you try to apply them to any particular case. Because again, if you take just a random median, I don't know, just take 10 or 100 random court cases in which you think that the defendant is actually guilty. Then you ask, what are the kinds of conditions in which they found themselves? Was it the case that maybe there was violence and transgressions against them, especially when they were children? And very often the answer very clearly would be yes. And so you see, like immediately you have this kind of very partial application of justice. Somebody, has grown up to be a rapist, and you send them to prison, or maybe even, sentence them to death, but you don't ask and you don't punish the people who have created the conditions for them becoming a rapist. So this partial and one-sided application of justice is not justice at all. And I mean, just several generations ago, maybe 100 or 150 years, most of the countries, even of this quote-unquote civilized West, had arrangements which we today would find, amoral and illegal. Like, in so many words, let me just say that the capitalist order, the capitalist liberal order, is very often very much continuous with the feudal order which existed before it. So if you want to apply Kantian and Lockean morality in a consistent fashion, then you have to go back in time and sort of demand reparations and restitution for all the crimes that were committed in the past. And I mean, okay, you could say somebody, who's member of the bourgeoisie today did not themselves commit the crime, but they benefited. They benefit from the wealth which they have inherited. And this inherited wealth, in most cases, cannot be defended as legitimate, using Lockean or Kantian standards. So you need to redraw the entire lines. You need to redraw. Like, if you want to be a consistent Lockean and a consistent Kantian, you need to kind of redraw the basic structure of society. I don't know. Like, you need to perform some kind of this great restitution, which is untenable and unworkable and will not be performed. Will not be performed because it will not even be acknowledged by the ruling classes that there is this injustice at the root of the system. And this is why kind of the realist perspective and the Marxist perspective are so important to me. Because both the realists and the Marxists very clearly acknowledge that our society is patently and obviously based on coercion and violence, history of coercion and violence. And in a society which is based on coercion and violence through and through, then applying justice in a one-sided fashion, in a one-sided manner, is no justice at all, even in Kantian and Lockean terms. So I could go on about this for a long, long time, but let me just again draw some kind of an intermediate conclusion. I feel kind of the right way of doing ethics and politics is not to look backward at past transgressions, because that's the issue. People have valid claims against each other since time immemorial. One conflict that, at least until recent times, was fairly remote and I felt moderately comfortable bringing up is the conflict between Irish Catholics and British Protestants in Ireland. You have this history of violence which goes back, generation after generation. Yeah, both sides have valid claims against each other. I feel that this example shows the untenable position of either Locke or Kant, because it's impossible to untangle this mess. The only way to move forward is to, let bygones be bygones and think in terms of common interest and, not look back, but look forward and construct some kind of policy based on common interest, common interest between Irish Catholics and British Protestants, common interest between Israelis and Palestinians, common interest between, Christians and Muslims, etc., etc., etc. Because, again, Marx's ultimate point is that what we have is the objective common interest of humanity. Well, I mean, before that, there's the objective common interest of workers worldwide, workers of the world unite. But then, on my reading of Marx, there's also a huge overlapping interest between, bourgeoisie and proletariat in moving forward and in moving beyond capitalism. And these would be the global challenges that face humanity in the future. That's kind of the idea of the socialist program, right? A true Marxist communist revolution is not the revenge of the poor against the rich. It's not the revenge of the poor against the rich. It is an evolution to a higher stage of human society in which hopefully, ideally, everybody benefits. Marx says, again, very explicitly in the German ideology, that in communism, there is no difference between altruism and egoism. And so, I mean, maybe to take a bit of a step back. So I've started this discussion of Marxism by talking about, let's say, kind of this individual domestic violence, kind of within a given country, a particular person commits a crime, how do we analyze this in Marxist terms? But then we have to move beyond the borders because, and this is where I would call on somebody like Immanuel Wallerstein with his world systems theory, because we don't live in this isolated, spherical capitalism in a vacuum, spherical capitalist cow in a vacuum when there's just one nation, one ruling class, and one oppressed class. We live in a world, in a post-colonial world, where effectively you have bourgeois nations and workers' nations, right? And Wallerstein talks about this: countries of the core, the bourgeois, the bourgeois capital-intensive countries of the core, and then you have the proletarian, labor-intensive countries of the periphery. So this already is a much more complicated system because, Lenin talks about this in terms of this bourgeoisification of the proletariat, that very often in countries of the core, you don't see pure proletariat, yes? What you see is bourgeoisified proletariat, and then this phrase, concessions. Workers of the countries of the first world exploit the workers in the countries of the third world. So there's a lot to be said about this, and we could have like a whole lecture on Wallerstein, but kind of to continue this analogy. So I've said you have this kind of worker crime, blue collar crime. You take a brick and you smash the window, right? And kind of crime is the result of poverty and desperation in an important respect, right? And so the idea here would be similar, that that social conditions reflect economic conditions. Let's take maybe the most important example, the most important question, the question of politics, democracy, accountability, transparency. Do we say that the countries of the core are democratic and the countries of the periphery are authoritarian? By and large, the answer is yes. And this immediately is a big problem, right? Because very often kind of the justification for the violence that the countries of the core perpetrate against the countries of the periphery is that, they are trying to help spread democracy. Well, this is very disingenuous, according to, again, Marxist or Wallersteinian analysis, because the countries of the core are undemocratic because they cannot afford to be democratic. They are authoritarian because the system makes them authoritarian. Not to mention that, again, how much democracy, how much real functioning democracy, how much transparency and accountability, how much responsibility to the government do you have in the countries of the core? How much does just a regular person living in Britain or in Germany, in France, or in the United States of America, how much say does a particular given individual, especially working individual, which is most of the people, how much say do they have in the politics of their country? Of course, also, you talk about elections, but then you remember with Althusser that you have repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatus. So when people cast their vote, is this because this is some kind of, reflection of their true position, or is it because they were brainwashed by television and educational system to vote in a particular way? So, the Marxist hypothesis is that you don't have anything like a working functional democracy in the West. You have capitalist parliamentarism, and this capitalist parliamentarism is kind of this soft, humane authoritarianism that, the countries of the West are by and large as authoritarian as, countries of the globalized West, are just as authoritarian as countries, let's say, of the third world, just as authoritarian, but they are much more palatable to their populations because they can afford to engage in economic concessions. So countries of the core are not really more democratic, they are richer. And because they are richer and because they can concede, they can, give economic concessions to the bourgeoisified working class in these first world countries of the core. That is why people consent, not because there's kind of real democracy, transparency, and accountability, but because it's something like a bribe, something along the lines of, my government is not responsible and not accountable to me, but my life isn't so bad, so I'm not going to protest, and so I will give my sort of begrudging, tacit consent, which is not really consent. And then, to continue this, the idea is that in the countries of the periphery, because they are labor intensive, because they are sort of these kind of proletarian nations, they do not have the surplus to divide to the workers, and so they cannot give concessions. And so the only thing that they can do is engage in forms of authoritarian behavior. But, to blame countries of the third world for lack of democracy is appalling, really, I would say, from a Marxist standpoint. They are undemocratic because they are poor, and they are poor because they're exploited. So I'm not sure if I should give this example or not in a very explicit fashion, but it's like, you can think of examples. You can think of examples when a rich capitalist superpower invades a smaller, poorer country on the pretext of spreading democracy, whereas the real reason why the smaller, poorer country doesn't have democracy is precisely because it's poor, and it's poor because it's exploited by this capitalist superpower. So you have this kind of neoliberal capitalist imperialist order in which these kind of countries of the core are firefighter and arsonist at the same time. They create the conditions for authoritarianism in the countries of the periphery, and then they come in and say, well, let's try to help make you more democratic. So again, firefighter and arsonist at the same time. Of course, when they say we're going to help make your country more democratic, well, is that really going to be the case, or is this just a smokescreen for some kind of a policy of divide and conquer? I mean, that's the thing about the economic system. Again, in countries of the core, because you have surplus to give concessions to your bourgeoisified proletariat, by and large, people are content. But in the countries of the periphery, because there's no surplus, because the countries are exploited, there isn't much surplus to go around, so people are always discontented. And so it is very easy for the countries of the core to send their agents to come in, agents broadly speaking, or in general, just to come in and to ask people, like workers in the countries of the periphery, labor-intensive, proletarian countries, ask, are you satisfied? Do you support your government? And again, whereas in the countries of the core, often or sometimes the bourgeoisified workers would go along with the government because they are contented because of the concessions. In the proletarian countries of the periphery, if you want in the third world, the workers are overwhelmingly likely to say no, they are not satisfied. So it's very easy to use this pretext of democracy, promoting democracy or spreading democracy, to use this pretext. Because of course, you can always find people who are discontented, and with just a little bit of money or financing or just promises, it's very easy to mobilize them against their governments. This is kind of, you could say, post-colonial, but really just colonial imperialist strategy. And like at some point, when you try to think through this and go into the past, you run into a kind of a very unpalatable history, which the West doesn't want people to think about. So when the European empires, let's say in the 19th century, come in and colonize places around the world, they find these places, the colonized places, usually live in some form of feudal or quasi-feudal arrangement. Of course, there is no democracy. I mean, the British moving into Mughal India. Is Mughal India a democracy? Is it the fault somehow of Mughal India that they do not have a democracy? You see how this kind of post-colonial studies, this is very, very patent, like a racist idea, that you have these horrible barbarians who have this horrible oppressive feudal arrangement. Why, again, within this racist colonial ideology, there has to be some kind of an explanation that these are, Untermenschen, and so it's fine for us, the white man's burden, to come in and impose our rule and to try to civilize them, which is, very obviously a smokescreen, right, for oppression and, colonization, colonial exploitation and extraction of resources. Now, there's more to be said about this, and I am simplifying, oversimplifying, and generalizing it very often. Like, this is just, understand that in terms of explanation, serious explanation of human history, of world history, this is at best just kind of a piece of a caricature, which is to say, it is only a very partial and a very caricatured, very oversimplified explanation. So I don't mean this as a final analysis, but I suppose what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give you a certain kind of taste for this kind of an analysis, which is a very different analysis. Yeah. So to try to maybe get to some kind of a substantial conclusion, which is actually the reason why I started recording this whole draft. The substantial conclusion might be that when you see a government which is, described as authoritarian, yeah, and it may very well be authoritarian. When you have an authoritarian government deploying state violence against its own citizens, or maybe deploying violence against the citizens of a neighboring country, maybe invading a neighboring country, the Marxist approach would urge us to take a step back and to ask, why is this happening? Not to kind of essentialize and demonize the actors. Again, the violence that authoritarian states in the periphery, in the proletarian nations, the violence that they perpetrate against their own proletariat, yeah, is part of this systemic violence which is endemic and essential to the functioning of the global capitalist order. Like in a very straightforward fashion, when I'm talking to you right now, when I'm recording this, I look around the room in which I'm in, and most of the things are I see around me, most of the objects, goods I see around me, including the microphone into which I'm speaking right now, is made in these countries, labor-intensive proletarian countries of the periphery. This microphone is very straightforwardly made in China, and in fact, most things I see around me is made in China. And to say that China is somehow authoritarian and oppresses its people is deeply disingenuous, because overwhelmingly the global political order, but also very importantly, more importantly, the global economic order is based on this kind of oppression and violence. So it's a global problem, and it needs a global solution. And it's useless, counterproductive, but also harmful and also disingenuous to just blame, let's say, the government of China for not observing the human rights of workers. Which is not to condone the actions, but you have to see what the cause is. Because unless you see what the cause is, you cannot have an effective solution. And then, of course, one has to take a properly historical view of things. Because ultimately, the reason, this division between countries of the core and countries of the periphery has been manufactured historically, right? They are products of a colonial imperialist order, and an integral part of this colonial imperialist order was a certain kind of regime of borders that countries of the core do not allow immigration from countries of the periphery. And this kind of, again, plays into this right-wing populist agenda in the countries of the core today. And I feel maybe one of the worst mistakes that political and social theorists can make, or let's say, I don't know, newscasters can make, is to identify the people with the actions of the government and to essentialize the actions of the government. Again, there's a system of global capitalism, and this system produces a certain kind of international order with, again, countries of the core and countries of the periphery, countries of the capitalist core and countries of the proletarian periphery. And countries of the periphery are, forced into a certain mold by this general world order. The workers, which is the majority of the population, the workers in the countries of the periphery are forced into a particular mold. And so to say, for example, to blame the voters, the workers who are the voters, right, of the countries of the periphery for the actions of their government it's a horrible mistake. It's to get it just completely 180 degrees backwards. People in the peripheral proletarian countries were made poor by the system. They were made, uneducated by the system. They kind of this logic of divide and conquer. They were prevented from being given access to the benefits of the system. And maybe they wholeheartedly support their authoritarian governments because they don't know better. because they were not given the tools to be able to know better. And so, again, whereas I say very explicitly, and let me repeat, I feel that Locke and Kant are wrong and bad, bad and wrong and unhelpful, deleterious. They make the situation even worse. And the alternative is a certain kind of systemic analysis which recognizes the kind of the economic or broader social political basis of the situation and trying to work to ameliorate that. And Marxism does have a program. It's a complicated program to carry out, but at least in theory it's there, trying to build robust institutions of civil society across the state lines, and very importantly, trying to work to increase the access and the standard of living, the access to the goods, to welfare, but also to increase the access to education and to increase the access to this, free and equal discussion in the robust institutions of civil society across the borders. This is why I started with this Gramscian idea of, war of position, Gramscian idea of war of position kind of in this Habermasian fashion that seeks to expand this Lebenswelt of communicative rationality, of this free and equal discussion, again, robust institutions of civil society. It's not easy to do, and it's an uphill struggle, and it's a struggle that can be lost or can be won. But I mean, the stakes are clear, and the stakes are socialism or barbarism. And it's not the third world proletarian peripheral states who choose barbarism. No. The agency for Marx, agency is not really there for Marx, I feel. This is a structuralist analysis. But the ball, so to speak, is on the side of the countries of the core. Marx very explicitly says it is the more advanced working class in England that needs to unionize across the border with the Irish workers and help the Irish workers unionize, help them gain consciousness, self-consciousness, class consciousness. This is a movement that has to begin within the countries of the core and then spread outside, spread outward. Like in Marxist terms, you need the Communist International with the capital, with the headquarters in the leading capitalist countries of the world, which have the most resources to analyze the situation, to make a map of the situation, to understand what the situation is, and then using this understanding to build relations, again, across borders, because this is what we need. Again, the international workers' nation, starting from the countries kind of in the global core, global capitalist core, and then moving outward to the periphery. Now, it's an uphill struggle, and it's very difficult to do, primarily because the economic incentive of workers in the first world countries, and this is what we see with right-wing populism today, is that of course workers in first world countries and countries of the core do not really want to improve the lot of workers in the third world countries. They want to work, they want to gain more concessions from their own governments. This is kind of what Marxist analysis leads us to. This is the structure of their economic incentives. And this is why, again, even though we have this kind of socialism or barbarism, right? This is why the countries of the core choose over and over and over again, they choose barbarism, because it's there in their immediate economic interest. It's against the long-term economic interest of humanity. It's against the long-term economic interest of the countries of the core as well, but it's in their short, narrow, myopic, immediate self-interest. This is why, again, kind of socialism or barbarism, but then when we look at this socialism or barbarism dichotomy, Gramsci talks about the pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Yes, in terms of the will, we are optimistic that maybe there will be somehow a political will, born out of this drive towards free and equal discussion, born out of this, drive for communicative rationality that Habermas talks about. We hope that this will be there, but so we have this optimism of the will, but intellectually speaking, like in terms of the analysis, we see that the deck is stacked against us, and this is why we have this pessimism of the intellect. And kind of the optimism of the will is that humanity will choose socialism over barbarism, But the pessimism of the intellect says that, the deck is stacked against that. The deck is stacked in favor of barbarism, against socialism. And I feel that this is the situation in which I find myself as a teacher of philosophy, as somebody who can afford to be a teacher of philosophy, a deeply bourgeois profession. And unfortunately, I find myself returning back to, to Socrates, to Rousseau, and to Foucault, but let's say to Socrates, again, this idea, but, Rousseau and Foucault would agree with this, probably, especially Rousseau, that, you look around, you ask yourself this question, what will humanity choose, socialism or barbarism? And you see humanity leaning towards barbarism, and you see, society is going to hell. Rousseau says on the social contract that, upon close examination, it will be found that very few states have laws. And the solution in Foucault and in Rousseau, and, going back all the way to Socrates, is a certain kind of an individual project. This is very unsatisfying, and this is very bourgeois. You have this bourgeois individualism. Oh, society is going to hell, so we are, as existentialists or Stoics or Buddhists, we're going to, take care of our souls. We're going to sit down and meditate. And I want to say it's unsatisfying. It is kind of a conservative, bourgeois, unsatisfying answer that, as the world is going to hell, take care of yourself. But then the hope, and it is a very ambitious hope, I have to confess. The hope is that by taking care of ourselves, we can, ultimately, down the line, enact certain kind of, positive social change. And this Gramscian, slow and tedious war of position, this Weberian, slow boring of hard boards. Again, exactly this Socratic fashion. Socrates doesn't talk urbi et orbi. He talks to particular individuals, kind of start with yourself. Start with the people who are closest to you. Try to think clearly for yourself, to maintain mindfulness and maybe even compassion. Start with yourself, cultivate your immediate circle, and then, again, hopefully down the line, this may translate into a certain kind of critical mass of people who are, self-conscious and compassionate. Compassionate, not because compassion is this kind of, Lockean or Kantian deontological virtue, but compassionate because we have this robust, overwhelming common interest. We are in this together. Again, this Marxist free development of each as a condition for the free development of all, such that by taking care of yourself, you then become better equipped to take care of others. And then, kind of in this feedback loop, altruism and egoism, by taking care of others, having taken care of others, you then create the conditions for your own individual flourishing. At least that's the hope. And I think, colleagues, on this happy note, I should probably wrap up. I hope this was instructive. I hope this was maybe productive and stimulating. So, colleagues, once again, take care, and I hope I'll see you next time.